is Lisa Butterworth, and I'm here with Alice Roberts for the Mormon Sex Info podcast. Welcome, Alice.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Alice, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and then your topic?
Yeah, so I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I work at Wasatch Family Therapy in Utah. I primarily work with couples and individuals dealing with sexual health issues, although I also work with anxiety, depression, stuff like that. So yeah, that's kind of my basics.
And tell us about your topic and why you were drawn to it.
So I want to talk about sexual shame. This is a topic that I feel really passionate about. I feel really lucky that my own parents were fairly open about sex growing up, at least they were really non-shaming. But even with that, they're in LDS culture, there is so much shame just in the water that it becomes almost like what's the term? It's something that we pass down from one generation to another. And I think we all try to do a little bit better than the generation before us did, but it's still there. And I see how it impacts individuals and relationships pretty much on a daily basis through my work. So it's something I feel really passionate about. And I want to work toward, first of all, just like healing the shame that people experience, but then also as people are able to heal their own shame, they're less likely to pass it on to the next generation.
Yeah, I was thinking that the word might be an inheritance, but like not the good kind, not the good kind.
Yeah. Yeah, our shame inheritance.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about what you found and like how you found it?
Yeah. I want to start. There was a PhD candidate, I think, at Seattle Pacific University a couple of years ago that did her dissertation on sexual shame. And so she came up with a definition that I really love, and I would like to just read it, if that's okay.
Sounds perfect.
So she says, sexual shame is a visceral feeling of humiliation and disgust toward one's own body and identity as a sexual being, and a belief of being abnormal, inferior, and unworthy. This feeling can be internalized, but also manifests in interpersonal relationships, having a negative impact on trust, communication, and physical and emotional intimacy. She talks about sexual shame develops across the lifespan in interactions with interpersonal relationships, one's culture and society, and then subsequent critical self-appraisal. There is also a fear and uncertainty related to one's power or right to make decisions, including safety decisions related to sexual encounters, along with an internalized judgment toward one's own sexual desire. So I know there's kind of a lot there, but I feel like, that covers all the critical points of how and why sexual shame is such a problem.
And it's so powerful too, because I mean, even as a definition, it gives us so much power to see something, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like if you've been feeling these feelings that just got defined in that definition,
right?
Wow, it's so powerful to like see it in black and white and be like, oh, wow, that describes my experience so well.
Yeah. One of the things that I've been thinking about with this, with the how do we do better for the next generation? And I think that's what you just said, that's a huge part of it, is just giving things a name so that kids or young people can identify, oh yeah, that's sexual shame, or when they come across situations where they feel shame, they can say, hey, this is not about me. This is something that, other people are trying to put on me because of their own fears or worries or, insecurities. So yeah, just being able to give it a name.
I love that. And it's so weirdly powerful.
Yeah. So there's a Facebook group that I'm in that I asked people to share their stories of where they feel like their sexual shame came from. And there were it was painful to read through all of it. There were so many responses, and I can't share all of them. Some of them were really personal, but I kind of clustered them into categories. So I want to share that for anyone listening. I'm sure, we all have our own experiences and things, but being able to identify like some of the areas where this sexual shame comes from or how it's passed on, I think that's helpful. So a lot of people shared experiences with analogies. So chewed gum, nails in a board. There was one really unfortunate one involving a Twinkie. I'm trying to think of the others. The one with the rose where it gets passed around and then the petals are all wilty. So just a whole
The
host
cabbage. I remember the cabbage.
I have not heard that one.
And then there's the camel in the tent.
Yeah, I've heard that one.
Yeah, that one was in the Young Women's Manual.
Nice. Yeah.
The old one that we grew up with.
Yeah. So there's so many analogies that really were sincerely meant to be helpful. But I think we're learning and we know better now that these were really damaging. So a few people shared, being told that death is better than losing virtue. And I remember that one. So this idea of like, if you're going to be raped, you should fight so hard that you were killed because that's somehow preferable to whatever this idea of this loss of virtue might be.
Yeah. I don't know if you remember reading A Miracle of Forgiveness, but that one was in there. And I remember reading it. And I remember immediately, like in my own 14-year-old skin, sort of being like, no, that's crazy. But I know that for some people that isn't possible. Like for some people, that becomes like very internalized. And I feel lucky that for whatever reason, that one I didn't internalize.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So several people shared, just this focus on keeping their thoughts pure. And that's one I think it might still be in the First Strength of Youth booklet, this idea of, pure thoughts. I had one person share a story with me that, they heard this message that, my thoughts have to be pure, which almost created kind of this shame spiral just with that thought. Like every time they had some thought that wasn't, pure, air quote, pure, then they immediately felt guilty and like they had sinned, but then they couldn't get that thought out of their head.
Yeah. Well, it creates that ironic processing problem that's been studied through like that white bear story where they take people into a room and they say, don't think about a white bear. And for the next 5 minutes, every time you don't think about you think about a white bear, mark this, but don't do that. Don't think about it. It also reminds me of, and maybe this is a different category, a lot of boys especially were told to hum a hymn when they're having a sexual thought.
Yes.
And then every time, yeah.
Yeah, I have talked to people who and I'm sure this isn't a thing for everyone, we all internalize things differently, but for some people doing that created this really unfortunate reaction during church whenever they would sing a hymn.
Yeah.
So
right.
That one's one to kind of watch out for.
For sure.
Another one, and I remember this one too, like if you're watching a TV show with your parents and there's some kind of kissing or sex scene, doesn't even have to be like anything really intense, just like some kind of kissing. So having your parents reach over and cover your eyes and laugh uncomfortably. That sends a powerful message.
Yeah. I remember my mom jumping up. She'd jump up from her chair and be like, oh my, oh my. And then she'd like walk around in circles, like looking for the remote, I think.
Yeah. And so that teaches kids that like, this is an uncomfortable thing. And when this stuff comes up, we can't talk about it. We have to avoid or run away from it.
Right.
So another one, when parents would shut down, or leaders shutting down natural curiosity rather than answering questions. And again, I think that goes to that embarrassment. Like, I don't know how to talk about this. It feels uncomfortable. So I'm just going to shut it down and pretend it's not an issue. But then there's what that message leaves for kids again is we can't talk about sex stuff.
Right.
Teasing about physical body changes, so breast development or body hair or whatever else, even done, lighthearted, not meaning, to be harmful, can create a lot of shame surrounding sex or sexuality or bodies. Sex is bad as the only conversation. Or I don't know, I would add like sex is bad as any part of the conversation. It's a difference between like context and expectations and experiences versus, this is a universally bad, dangerous thing.
Right. Well, and what room does that leave for ever having a good sexual experience, you know?
Right.
And most LDS parents, what they want is for their kids to grow up and get married and then have sex only with their partner.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that's not a bad desire, right? Like
No.
if that works out for you, but if the only conversation you've ever had about sex is that it's bad and you're bad if you want to have it, which I think this is one of the big ones for a lot of the women I work with, especially, right? Like the only message they ever got was that sex was bad. And if they wanted sex, they were bad. Then they cannot get in touch with their sexual desire later in their life because
Mm-hmm.
they don't want to be bad.
Right. Yeah. And that's a whole nother podcast, but that brings up like a lot of issues that I see where a couple comes in, with this very different desire levels, and that typically, or whatever, the wife is not interested because she's been trained her whole life to shut all of those things down and to act as some kind of a gatekeeper to prevent, the boys around her from having negative or sexual thoughts, as if those are the same. And so, of course, she's going to go into this relationship and be like, yeah, I don't want that. That's bad. And then the partner, the husband, is interested in sex. And so he's bad.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And, like the thing that's interesting about this too is that you can understand intellectually that the context has changed. Like I'm no longer single, we're married. This should be
Mm-hmm.
okay. But it doesn't change sort of that physical response because you
Mm-hmm.
practice that a lot. You've practiced being like, oh, sex is bad, sex is dangerous. And so
Right.
the things you practice become who you are. And so if you've been
Right.
practicing for 10, 15, 20 years that sex is bad, then your body is going to respond that way because it's what you've practiced.
Yeah. It's like Emily Nagoski talks about brakes and accelerators, the things in our lives that act as a brake that tell us, nope, I'm not interested. So, like you said, 20 years of shutting that down and saying, nope, sex is bad, that's a huge break.
And
And
I think in a way that is what parents want, right? Like they want women to put on the brakes.
yeah,
But you can't just like take your foot off the brake all of a sudden if your foot's been slammed on the brake for the last 20 years.
right. Yeah. So trying to figure out new ways of approaching it so that, parents can teach children their values and their hopes, but in a way that views sexuality as a normal and healthy part of life.
Right.
Oh, so a few others. Parents getting upset or slapping the child's hand away when children discover that touching their penis or labia or clitoris feels good. People being blamed for their own sexual assault, particularly if their body had a physical response. So, like it felt good in some way or they orgasmed, which, non-concordance, our body doesn't always agree with what our brain wants. But in the past, and probably currently still, that gets used against victims to say, well, your body had this response, so you must have wanted it.
Right. Sort of
Um,
like if you salivate when you smell good food and someone stuffs it down your throat, you wanted it
right,
because you salivated.
right. Girls at girls camp being told to cover their swimsuits because there are priesthood leaders there. So many just like weird things in that one. First of all, why are we inviting males who are going to have a problem with seeing teenage girls in a swimsuit? That's icky. But also, again, telling girls that it's their job, like that their bodies are inherently sexual and that's bad. And they have to protect everyone else from seeing these wicked bodies.
Yeah. And, and there's a very anti-male sentiment in there as well. Like
Right,
these priesthood leaders are animals who can't
right.
help their sexual feelings, right? Um,
Yeah,
and most of these priesthood leaders are not going to have sexual feelings about, a bunch of teenage girls in swimsuits. But then that kind of does go back to those initial ones of like, okay, well, what if they do? How do we handle it? Well, if I have a sexual thought, then I'm bad, right? And that was one of the earlier ones you talked about. So it sort of all comes full circle.
yeah. And so with the priesthood leaders being kind of treated as animals, that was another one. Being told that they can't control themselves. And that's not a message I think that most boys get directly, but that's the indirect message of when you tell boys and girls that girls need to cover up to protect the boys. It sends that message to the boys that this is a dangerous part of me, and if I'm not careful with it, it could get out of control and I could do something horrible with it.
Right. Yep.
A couple of people commented about hearing derogatory messages about LGBTQ issues, and then internalizing those.
One of the things I always think it's good to think about is, like in Sunday school or wherever we happen to be, assume that the person you're talking about is in the room.
Mm-hmm.
Like because we can get so sort of like us versus them about certain people, like, oh, well, those people. And you're going to talk about it very differently if those people are in the room. Like if you assume that there is a Black person or a Latino person or an LGBTQ person or even a sex worker. I remember people getting really like, oh, those whores, and using that word from the Bible in such like a dehumanizing way, right? Like, well, if you were standing in front of somebody who was a sex worker, would you be using that language in that same way? Um, because we tend to be kinder to people that are in front of us,
Yeah.
rather than like assuming that, oh, well, there's nobody LGBTQ here, so I can just tell you what I really think.
Yeah. And that's probably one of the biggest dangers of social media, is being able to post anonymously or from behind a screen, where anybody who might be reading it, you don't have to view them as a real person. But when we when we're face to face with somebody and we can see their humanity and we can see their pain, it tends to, at least hopefully, it softens us and helps us get to that place where we can be a little bit more thoughtful and gentle with the hearts and emotions of other people.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, on social media as well as at Sunday school, let's assume that the people we're talking about are in the room with.
Yeah, it's a good filter generally. So leaving, this is kind of, we've talked about this a little bit already, but leaving young people totally unprepared for any kind of sexual relationship. So just today I saw in the news that the Utah legislature, there was a bill in one of the committees, and they kind of decided to hold the bill in the committee, I guess, but it was on adding consent as a topic to discuss in sex ed, and they decided that they weren't going to push that bill through because apparently talking about consent is unimportant.
Yeah,
So the more, again, it's one of those things, like, they're probably really good intentions. We want to protect our kids. We want them to wait to have sexual relationships until they're married or whatever. But this good intention leads us to pull away from having difficult conversations. And I'm imagining like this idea with consent. If I tell a teenager that consent is important, the flip side of that is that they learn that they get to give consent. And what does that mean? If I don't want my kid having sex, I don't want them to know that they can give consent.
yeah.
So it's,
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, it's this like fine line between, protecting our children and teaching them the values we want them to know, but not doing it in a way that is actually more likely to lead to the things we're trying to avoid.
Right. And, that's one of the counterintuitive things. Like, what is more likely to lead to my child having sexual experiences that I don't want for them or that they don't want for themselves? And, like that fear of like, oh, well, if I talk to them about consent, they might consent to something I don't want for them. But
Mm-hmm.
what's more likely is that they will consent to something they don't want for themselves, right?
Yeah.
Because if you've taught your kids, and I know I was taught this pretty strongly over and over again, that I shouldn't say no to boys. If I get asked
Yeah.
to dance, I say yes. If I get asked out on a date, I say yes. If I get asked, I remember this happening once. I got asked to write letters over the summer to a boy. And I was supposed to say yes. I'm not really allowed to say no. And that was incredibly uncomfortable. And again, the things you practice are the things that your brain starts to learn how to do. And if you
Mm-hmm.
practice not saying no over and over again, prioritizing boys' feelings and what they want over what you want for yourself, that's where a lot of women get into a position where they're having sex they didn't want because their attempts to say no either weren't heard or they didn't really know how to set that boundary. And so, like then you get into a lot of harder things at that point.
Mm-hmm. And teaching or sending the message to boys that girls are always supposed to say yes, uh, puts them in a weird spot too. Like, what if a girl does ever say no? Then they have no experience with how to deal with that in a healthy way. So I think, I mean, it hurts everybody.
Yeah, right? Like they feel entitled to women saying yes
Mm-hmm.
to them. And that doesn't just apply to, like if I ask them out on a date, they'll say yes to that. But the minute I want to do something sexual, then they'll say no. And I'm going to be really good at taking no for an answer.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I really love the conversations about consent that start in kindergarten or even younger. Like just teaching kids. I remember my youngest son, when he was in preschool, the preschool teachers, at the end of the day, the kids had like the options. They could do a high five, they could do some like sparkle glitter thing, they could do a hug, and they had all these options and they could choose. And that was this beautiful introduction to consent. Like I get to choose what I want to do with my body, and this teacher is going to respect that.
I remember when my kids were little, my kids are now in their late teens and 20s. But I remember that idea that kids had a right to say no to hugs was a new idea to me. Like
Yeah.
that was not something I had personally ever experienced, where if an adult wanted a hug or a kiss that I could say no, or tickles, or you know and I remember having a whole bunch of memories of being pushed into experiences that were really uncomfortable and like really unpleasant. And that was so powerful to me to learn that concept when my children were small, so that they felt like they had a right to say no and that the no needed to be listened to. That was powerful for me as a parent.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's so important.
The other thing with consent that I think is really important to bring up is that, in the framework of growing up Mormon, the only thing I ever learned about what sort of healthy sex looks like is married sex. But now that I'm a therapist and I have a lot of married people coming in and telling me about what their sex lives look like, it's really clear to me that they don't know what healthy sex looks like, right?
Yeah.
And consent is an absolutely essential feature in married sex. I mean, I would say a huge problem that I see over and over again are women who their no's were not listened to, or they were just, sort of told, well, you have to, like if you don't have sex with me X many times a week, I'm going to look at porn because I can't help myself because I'm an animal. And so she feels like, again, that it's her duty as a good wife to keep him from being an animal
Mm-hmm.
who can't help himself. And so then the sex isn't about her consent. It's not about their pleasure. It's just a job that she has to do. And man, if you want to kill someone's sex drive, that is a perfect recipe to do it.
Right. And I think about like the men in that position too, where they feel like their sex drive or their sexual urges are this animal that feels so out of control, and they're trying so hard to manage that by using their wife as a sex toy, essentially. That the desperation there, that I feel grief at that, um,
Absolutely.
because it's so unnecessary. But we get caught in these places where this is where those relationships can end up.
Right.
Yeah.
And if people don't have a concept of consent and how it's important to healthy sex, even in marriage, there's so many avenues for it to go south fast.
Yeah. The last one that I wrote down was when parents or leaders panic over developmentally appropriate sexual or body curiosity. So it is really normal for kids to have some kind of sexual play when they're little. Um, but I see over and over in some of the Facebook groups I'm in, where people will have this experience where they caught their kid playing with little brother or cousin or whatever, or neighbor, with their pants off, and they have this panic of like, oh no, is my 5-year-old or 4-year-old you know a sexual deviant? Are they a sexual offender? When really it's really normal developmentally for kids to be curious about that. And so, parents rush in and create all this panic and shame over what could have been a learning opportunity to teach kids consent and respect and boundaries and answer questions and normalize the curiosity.
Right. And I think again that response comes from a good place, like
Hmm.
we're afraid, you know, we're
Yeah.
afraid for our children's sexual development. We're all afraid of sexual predators, right? Like that is
Hmm.
something that for good reason in our culture we're all terrified of. And, can you speak a little bit more to like what are the signs that the indicators that this is normal sort of sexual developmental play versus this is something that is a problem?
So that is not my specialty, and I don't want to misspeak. But I will say my understanding is like if there is specific, like sexual acting out of specific sexual scenarios or like movements, that might be more of a reason for concern. But if it's just like, show me yours, I'll show you mine sort of a thing, that it's probably something that we talk about with our kids, but that we really got to do the work to manage our own anxiety or distress around it so that we are not passing that along.
Yeah. So, I mean, there are a few other signs that I know because I've worked with some different clients who, like have ambiguous stories of their own from their childhoods where they're, like asking themselves the question of like, okay, I had these sexual experiences with my siblings or my cousin. Were those like normal curiosity, or was I being abused,
Mm,
or was I being the abuser? Like,
hmm.
what was going on, and how do I know the difference? And from the research that I've done, and again, I'm not a super big expert, but everything you said is accurate. And also, generally speaking, if the child was just being curious, if you sort of set boundaries and say something like, well, anything that's in your swimsuit area, those are private and those are things that like if you're curious about, or you can come ask me questions, or, like you can look at yourself in your bedroom with your door closed or whatever, right?
Hmm.
If you set those boundaries and say, well, it's not appropriate to do that at school, well, that's usually the end of it.
Mm-hmm.
They're like, oh, okay, I didn't know that. Thanks for the information, Mom. And then they act in a different way because you've set a boundary around that. If it's accompanied by other forms of acting out, right? Like your child seemed fairly happy at school and now they're miserable and they don't want to go to school anymore. Or your child is acting in like new ways that seem concerning on some level, wetting the bed a lot more, or not wanting to, like go to certain places, or like really
Mm-hmm.
seeming anxious in a way that they weren't prior to those experiences. And being able to have a good conversation with your kids about what that's about. That seems to be important. There's not any like cut and dry answer that's like super specific.
Mm-hmm.
Also, if the kids involved were all about the same age, right?
Yes. Yeah.
If you have a 12-year-old involved in things with a 5-year-old, that's far more concerning than a 7, 6, or 5-year-old, doing
Mm-hmm.
something together. So those are some different things to keep in mind.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing those. So from all of these situations that people experience where generally good intentions, but sexuality gets shamed, and so they internalize that sex is bad, my body is bad, my sexuality is bad, and I need to hide or repress, um, or to the other extreme, my sexuality is bad and I can't control it, so here I go. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how shame impacts individuals and couples. And Lisa, maybe you can share some of the things that you see, but what I see a lot of how sexual shame impacts relationships, it makes it really difficult to communicate needs. There's a lot of like repression and shutting down of any kind of sexual energy, which you need in a relationship. If you're going to have a relationship that's all encompassing and that includes a healthy sex life, you need that sexual energy. And if you've constantly shut it down, you're going to be missing out on that. And we've talked about kind of the negative cycle that can come from that. The other thing that I see is a reactivity to the partner's sexuality. So if my partner is sexual and I'm trying to shut it all down in order to protect myself, I'm more likely to demonize my partner.
And
What do you see?
I feel like that goes in both directions, right? Like demonizing your
Mm,
partner,
yeah,
like for women with low sex drive. And I just want to emphasize that this isn't always the case, right? Like sometimes it's the
right,
other way. Sometimes the
right.
men have the low sex drive and the women
Right,
have the higher.
which in some ways is probably even more difficult because people don't talk about it as much. And so if you are a woman with a high sex drive, you feel extra broken. Or if you're the man with the low sex drive, what's wrong with you, right?
Yeah,
Because that's not the problem you're supposed to have.
you're not very manly, or, oh, you're one of those kind of women,
Right.
And so, yeah, but often the way I see partners who have a low sex drive being sort of demonized is, generally speaking, the low desire partner is labeled the problem, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
you've got a problem. So they become the identified problem. And if the high desire partner, in, like again, with the best of intentions, is always like coming up with, well, maybe we could do this to fix it. Maybe you could do that to fix it. Maybe, like fix it, fix it, fix it. And so then the person with lower desire feels broken. And
Mm-hmm.
maybe they interacted with that, like fix it mentality for a while. And now they're tired of feeling broken and they don't want to fix it anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a common way that I see low desire partners getting kind of demonized. High desire partners, again, kind of going back to the shame stories that you were talking about earlier, like high desire partners get that sort of religious shame of like, what's wrong with you? Why are you such an animal who's out of control? Your sexual feelings and your sexual thoughts are such an intrusion on my peace,
Mm-hmm.
or they're so hard for me to manage, and I don't want to manage your weird sexual desires anymore. And so it really kind of comes back to like there's something dirty or bad about your wanting sex.
That ties into one of the things I see with individuals a little bit more when they have this history of sexuality, of feeling shame about their sexuality, is it can actually lead to an increase in compulsive behaviors.
Right.
So I heard a story lots of years ago about a young man who went swimming with his family and saw at the pool that there were girls in bikinis, and he was so uncomfortable that he left. And the family was so proud of him, for not exposing himself to this dangerous situation. And I want to leave lots of space for people to have their own beliefs and values, but I also really want to confront this idea that sexuality is something that we have to run away from.
Yeah. It's intense, right? Like how do we learn to manage our sexual feelings if we always run away whenever a sexual feeling comes up?
Yeah, it's like any other difficult emotion. Can we learn to sit with it? Can we learn to accept, yeah, this is what I'm feeling right now. What do I want to do with it? Because then we get to decide instead of feeling like this is something I have no control over that I have to hide from.
Right.
We can acknowledge I'm feeling sexual feelings right now. I'm feeling aroused. These images or these other people that I'm seeing are having this impact on me. And that's normal. And if that's a normal thing, then we get to decide, what do I want to do? Well, my values, I don't want to objectify other people. They haven't given me consent. And so I'm not going to have some kind of a sexual interaction with them. I'm going to decide to acknowledge how I'm feeling and then go about my day.
Yep. That's such good advice.
But it's a challenge, especially when there's so much fear about sexuality being out of control.
Right. Yeah.
So what I think I was saying before with compulsive behaviors, when individuals get in this pattern of, I see something or I hear something and it brings up sexual feelings for me, and then I feel ashamed of them because those are bad. I'm not supposed to have those. Uh, so this tension builds up, and the tension can only build up for so long before we got to do something with it. And a lot of times, things that we find to soothe ourselves, sometimes we find healthy things, but sometimes when we're trying to run away from something, we turn to things that are not so helpful for us. So, you know, maybe a kid has grown up learning that masturbating feels really good and relieves, her stress or her tension. And so she's in this experience where she's feeling a lot of sexual shame and trying to shut it down. And so she goes home and masturbates, and then she feels better. But then she's been told that that's bad. And so, now I'm like doubly bad. I can't do anything right. And so that tension starts to build again. And then as it builds and it builds, she's going to go back to the same thing that worked so well last time. And then we've got a lovely shame spiral going on where that behavior becomes compulsive. Whereas before, like, it could have been a one-off thing.
Yeah. And this, I think, sets up another thing I see pretty commonly in my clients, which is that, like, we didn't learn to soothe ourselves, our especially our sexual fears. We didn't learn how to do that with other people, right? Like if I had a sexual fear, if I had a thought or a feeling that was maybe a little bit disturbing or scary or, you know, something, or if I had an experience where I saw something a little bit disturbing or scary on purpose or not, I did not learn that I could go and talk to my mom and dad about that and say, oh, this thing, this, like this was, I had this experience, or I saw this thing, or I thought this thought. And because we learn that, like our sexual feelings need to be hidden, from everybody, including our parents, including people that other than, to go to the bishop. And sometimes bishops are pretty good at like soothing sexual shame. Sometimes
Mhm.
they're not, right? Like sometimes they like say things or do things that make that sexual shame even worse. And
Mhm.
so if I and that's only if you work up the courage or whatever. I'm not sure courage is the right word to go to the bishop, right? Like if you're having sexual thoughts and you're like, oh, should I go? Should I not go? And you kind of default to, I'm not going to go. But we learn to soothe ourselves and our sexual fears in isolation, right? Like we don't learn that
Mhm.
there are ways that we can be soothed, by people that we trust to normalize the feeling or, um, give us positive outlets for those feelings. And
Mhm.
so then this becomes a lifelong habit. And so
Yeah.
even once you're married, you don't know how to seek soothing from your sexual partner. You're still in isolation with your sexual shame. You're still, all of your sexual fears are still something that you try not to think about as much as possible. And then certainly probably don't share with your partner. And sexual secrets um, are a huge reason why like sexual desire dies in marriage again.
Yeah.
Um, if you have sexual secrets that you don't feel you've never practiced sharing those things with people, you don't know how your partner's going to respond if you were to tell them. And this can, sexual secrets can include everything from like a history of sexual abuse
Mhm.
to a history of pornography use to a desire that you think is weird or shameful, or a fantasy that you think is, you know, dirty or bad, like, or your sexual orientation. Like, that's a big
Yeah.
one, right? So these sexual secrets get in the way of a good married relationship in general and a satisfying sexual relationship in specific.
Yeah. So one of the things that I do a lot of work with is when when there's this shame, like how do we start to heal it? And I love that you talked about, can we turn to somebody that cares about us or that we care about as a support person to share that shame, because shame thrives in silence and secrecy. And once we shed some light on it, once we share it, a lot of it can kind of fade. I mean, maybe it doesn't totally go away, but it gets easier to deal with because you know that you're not alone. So one of the approaches I use, that probably more in individual therapy than with couples, because when you have a couple there, like, they can practice turning toward each other and sharing some of these things. But when it's an individual, maybe they don't always have a support system that they feel safe or ready to turn to. And so finding another option so that they are just not stuck, um, in this place of shame. So I think, first of all, the biggest thing that we can do to help heal sexual shame is to just make space for it, to recognize that it's a part of us, and it's a part that's probably working really hard to keep us safe, protecting us from, like, maybe judgment of others, our own judgment, or maybe even judgment from God. So that part of us that feels that shame isn't a bad part. It's just a part that needs to be taken care of a little bit. I like to view, I use the school bus analogy, or the bus analogy. Like, if all of our parts, inside of us, we have all these different parts, and all of our parts are on this bus. And when a part gets activated, so when something happens that triggers those feelings of shame, that part gets up and tries to take over the wheel. So that part's now the part that's driving the bus. But there are things that we can do to help reassure that part, and bring, help them find a nice, comfortable seat where they feel safe and secure and they have what they need. Um, and then what I call, or what Richard Schwartz calls, the true self can be the one to take back over of that, take back control of the steering wheel. And we can be operating from this place, of our true self. So Richard Schwartz came up with internal family systems therapy, and this parts language, and he calls the who we are at our core, that's our true self. The attributes of our true self are calm, curious, compassionate, courageous, creative, connected, confident, and has clarity. The true self is also non-judgmental and really has no agenda outside of just like our well-being. So we can use that true self, to soothe the parts of us that are feeling shame or feeling hurt. And there's a mindfulness practice that I like to use. So, if you imagine times in your life when you did feel calm, curious, compassionate, courageous, creative, connected, confident, or like you had clarity, remember those times, think about what it was like to be in that space and notice what you feel in your body. So for me, when I think about, times when I'm all of those things, calm, curious, compassionate, etc., I feel powerful. I feel capable. I feel a lightness in my chest. I feel hopeful. And so I can use that energy that comes just from remembering these past situations where I felt like I was really my best self, my true self. From a spiritual perspective, I like the imagery or the idea that my true self is my spirit. That's who I am, who I was created to be. And all of these parts, that get big sometimes, those are just the parts of me that are trying to deal with life. But inside me, there's kind of a kinder, wiser, higher being. And I can access that higher being when I need it to soothe the parts and help me get through whatever it is I'm getting through. So this mindfulness, imagining a time when you felt calm, curious, compassionate, etc., and taking a deep breath in. And I like to imagine, so this feeling of hope and power and strength, or whatever it is for the individual. I imagine it as like a little ball or a balloon in your chest. And as you take a deep breath in through your nose, you imagine that balloon filling and expanding into your body. So all of those feelings of hope and calm and whatever else start to fill your body. And then you breathe out and the balloon recedes just a little bit, but not too much. And then you breathe in again and it gets bigger. And you keep doing that until you can feel that sense of calm spread throughout your body. And you don't need it to fill up everything. You just need it enough that it gives you a little bit of distance between yourself and that part that's feeling the shame. And when there's a little bit of space between the self and the shame part, then yourself can come and wrap their arms around that part of you that feels the shame and can let them know, like, hey, I am here. I know that this is painful, but you are not alone and we are going to figure this out together.
I love that. I love the idea of the true self as like the spirit, or even like our divine nature, or like, and I feel like that this divine nature, or being a child of God, or however you want to frame it within a spiritual context, every religion has an idea of this thing, right? Like of this sort of inner self that has I think the Buddha self is one of the ways that another religion refers to it, or the light within, within Hinduism. And so, every major religion has an idea of this sort of like inner self, or the spirit. And one of the things to think about with that is that it really does require kind of a leap of faith to believe
Mm-hmm.
in your own like divine nature, right? Like a lot of these behaviors, and in fact, this was a conversation I had this morning with a client, right? Like her son is engaging in behaviors that she finds very frightening. Like he's an older teenager, he's like he is interested in or has started doing drugs. She suspects he's probably sleeping with her girlfriend. She has seen these kinds of behaviors in the past with her brothers and brothers-in-law, and has seen like really scary bad outcomes for them
Mm-hmm.
in the long term. And she's very scared about her son's behavior. She's terrified, right? And
Yeah.
she can completely acknowledge that her son doesn't feel safe coming to her about these behaviors, because she's always approached him in this sense of like, well, I can't condone what you're doing, right? And
Mm-hmm.
and that feels like judgment to him.
Right.
And when I asked her, like, what does it mean to condone, she could totally own the fact that like this was an attempt to find some sort of control in the situation,
Mm-hmm.
because she's scared about this, what her outcome for her child will be. And so we talked a little bit about how, the research shows pretty clearly that the thing that protects our children from out of control behaviors, whether that's drugs or sex or major mental health issues that could lead to suicide, is a feeling that they like have a safe place to come to, that they're accepted, that they're loved. And in fact, there's research on this in the LGBTQ sphere called the Family Acceptance Project.
Mm-hmm.
And they list really clearly, here are a list of accepting behaviors, here are a list of rejecting behaviors. And the more accepting behaviors you have in your relationships, the better outcomes there will be for your children. And she, and she's terrified. She's like, if I show these accepting behaviors toward my son, won't he feel like I'm accepting his choices? And I think that that's a question that a lot of parents of LGBTQ kids ask also, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
and I feel like this sort of true self or inner light is the ultimate leap of faith, right? Like we have to believe in our children's best self and in our own best self. And when we take that leap of faith and accept ourselves and our children for who we are, and accept that like, yeah, we'll make mistakes, that there is this letting go of control that feels terrifying, because
Mm-hmm.
we feel like we need to be like all wound up, like, oh, I need to make, like I need to make a rule, don't do this sex thing or don't do that sex thing. And if I
Right.
make those really strong rules, that will be the thing that will protect me from doing those things. But it doesn't really work out that way.
Yeah.
And the thing
It's
that we oh, go ahead.
it's the curiosity part. So the attributes of the self, like one of them is curiosity. Can I hold curiosity for the fact that I don't know what the end of this is going to look like yet? And on the part of your client where they do have these experiences in the past where they saw kind of how things played out, of course that's going to feel so scary. But can she hold space for, I don't know what this is going to look like with my child yet? And can I move forward, soothing those parts of myself that feel so terrified in ways that, I don't have to agree or approve of my kid's behavior, but I can talk about it differently than maybe, my parents talked about it with my brothers.
Right. And one of the things we do have where we're trying to predict the future is like these research studies that we have. And like the research is really clear that
Mm-hmm.
accepting behaviors where our children feel accepted and loved by us, result in good outcomes. And
Mm-hmm.
rejecting behaviors result in higher incidences of shame, higher incidences of addiction, higher incidences of out of control behavior of every type. And like it's rough to do when we're in the habit of sort of wanting to control and feeling like that's the thing that will
Mm-hmm.
like if I can just tell my son, don't do that. And if I can just tighten the rules, and if I can just make him, tell him how disappointed I am. And then if I can just make him see that his choices are going to lead to this really bad outcome, if I can just make him see, right? There's a very different energy to it. It's not open. It's not curious. It's very fear-based. It's not coming from our best self. And there's this huge leap of faith you have to take in order to sort of let go of that tightening.
And the thing I love about the parts language is it's not even so much that we don't have to get rid of that part, that terrified part. Like, we don't have to let go of that part. We have to acknowledge that part. And then we can talk that part through it. We can soothe that part. I am so sorry that you're so scared. I know that this is scary because you've had these experiences. Yes, it's going to be scary, but we are going to figure that out. And when we can talk to our parts that way, it does that thing in the brain where we're not operating from panic brain anymore. We're now operating from that idea of like wise mind, when our logic brain, our prefrontal cortex, and our amygdala are working together.
Right.
And then we can access like, hey, look, there is all this research on how to approach, kids for best outcomes. So I don't have to figure it all out myself. But when we're in that panic place, it's really hard to be able to say, oh yeah, okay, I can access this research.
Right. And it's something that we can practice, right? Like if we practiced the control and the judgment and the fear a lot, those are going to be easier behaviors, right? Like our brain likes to do things it's done a lot. And so if our way of dealing with shame has been to hide things and to, soothe ourselves in perhaps less than in ways that we find shameful, or to, withdraw or put up walls, then all of those behaviors, anything you've practiced a lot, is going to be easy, but that doesn't result for the outcomes that people want, right? If we want connection, if we want intimacy, if we want, like really good sex with our partners, if we want our children to have good sex with their partners, which is a hard thing to say, but we do want that, then we have to like make this leap of faith in believing in our own best self, in our own true self, and in our children's true self, and connect on that level.
Yeah. And we do it over and over again. And we acknowledge that, you know what, my brain is used to doing things this way. And that does feel comfortable and it feels easier, but it's not working for me. So I'm going to try something different. And I'm going to do that. I'm going to try that different thing over and over and over again. And I'm going to do it really messily until someday down the road, like all of a sudden I realized, it's not as difficult as it used to be. This old pattern that I used to fall into, that's not my default anymore, because I've worked at it over and over again to create a new, easier pattern in my brain.
Yeah.
And so it's okay if it takes a while and if it doesn't look neat and tidy. Like, just because you've heard, oh, I can use my true self to soothe, right? Just because I've heard that once doesn't mean I'm going to know how to do it perfectly. And so, like you said, it's, we practice.
And just like anything, the more you practice it, the easier it becomes. Scales on the piano used to be really hard, and now I can just sit down and pound them out really fast and easy, and I don't even have to think about it. My brain doesn't even have to engage. My brain can just do it.
Yeah.
That wouldn't have been true if I hadn't practiced the scales for hours and hours and hours.
Right.
Thank you, Sister Lofthouse, for making me practice my scales for hours. But that's one of those things where acknowledging that it's hard at first. It's hard at first to do something new. And the more we practice it, the easier it becomes. And it can become like your first go-to, right? Like sexual shame isn't my first go-to anymore. And it hasn't been for a long time. I certainly experienced most of the things, if not all of the things that you mentioned today. And it's been a long time since I have acted from that place of sexual shame as a default, right? And that isn't to say that it doesn't come up in me every once in a while. like in a certain context, right? Like somebody might say something, or something might happen, especially in the context of like our family of origin. That is often the place where things, the old patterns last longest. And that's okay too, right? Like it's okay if I go home for Christmas and those old shame stories come back up again, right? Like those shame stories are a part of who I am and who I was. They can be on the bus, but I don't have to give them the keys.
And I like to view, you know, those times when things do come back up again as just another opportunity to practice.
Right. And, you know, just like more information, like, oh, look, there's a place where I can still work on this thing. That makes it sound so positive, and it's really so frustrating, but doing our best to reframe it that way.
Right. Yeah. There's another way that I like to use the idea of the true self, you know, showing up, wrapping their arms around you, or wrapping their arms around that part of you anyway that's hurting, to provide comfort and soothing. But I also like this idea of kind of like a ghost of Christmas past sort of thing, where that shame part can take the true self back in time with them to revisit those experiences. And then that true self, you can imagine that true self intervening. Like, what would my true self have done if they had been there and they could have spoken up for me in a way that I couldn't at the time? You know, what would have changed if I had been able to do that?
I love that. I love that.
And I think it's, you know, sometimes this kind of shame is something that we can deal with. We can work through it. We can approach it in new ways, and it doesn't have to hold us back. I also think that sometimes we need help doing that, and that is okay. And so I would just encourage anybody, you know, if this is something that you're struggling with, to look around for a therapist that you feel comfortable with, that you feel safe with, that can help you process.
Yeah. And, you know, see if you can find people in your life, you know, safe people,
Mhm.
right? Like maybe you can have a conversation with your children, like if you're a parent, where you acknowledge, like, oh, wow, I'm looking at the ways I've talked to you about sex in the past, and I realize that I may have contributed to some of these shaming behaviors, and I'm really sorry. And I see the way that it's affected me, and I see the way that it might be affecting you. And that can be a really healing conversation. It's a
Yeah, I
hard
love that.
conversation,
But so
um,
beautiful.
right? And
And
then,
again, like going back to, it's just giving something a name. Like, yeah, this is this thing that we perpetuated because we were trying to do the right thing. But now we know better. And so we're going to try something different.
another thing that I would encourage you that takes a lot of courage is having a conversation with your kids about their sexual values. You know, like there is this tendency to assign our children their sexual values and to tell them this is what you
Hmm.
value. And this takes one of those leaps of faith and trusting in your child's true self, right?
Hmm.
But I read some really interesting research where this sex educator had two different classes. And in one class, she did an experiment where she asked the children to define their own sexual values. And then in the other class, she didn't do this. And then she followed up like 5 years later with these kids and asked them about their sexual experiences. And she found that the class who was asked to, first of all, define their sexual values, and then secondly, to ask themselves if their behaviors were in line with their values. So she gave them this like assignment to say, like, you know, and obviously these weren't LDS kids, but she was asking them, like, are your values in line with your behaviors? And she found that in 5 years, the kids who were asked to do this practice were much less likely to have been engaging in sexual behaviors that they regretted, much less
Hmm.
likely to be engaging in sexual behaviors that they felt were like derogatory or degrading in some way, because they had actually defined their own sexual values. And
Yeah.
we do run the risk again, like this is the control versus the leap of faith in our best self, right? Like if you think that imposing your values on your child is the best way to control their sexual behavior, the research doesn't really back that up in the
Yeah.
end. But if you trust in your child's best self to choose sexual values that will actually be good for them, and then give them the opportunity to ask the question of, are my behaviors in line with my values? And, like own their values because they're mine. They're not ones that were
Mhm.
imposed on me.
There's a book by a sex educator. His name's Vernacchio,
Mm-hmm.
and he talks about the importance of helping young people integrate their values into, the sexual education. So, like you said, what are my values? Do my values line up with my behavior? And if they don't, what do I want to do with that?
Right.
Because then it's not just something that, like, we're telling kids this is what you should believe, this is what you should do, because that works really well. It's encouraging young people to develop their own sense of sexual health, their own values regarding sexual health. And Douglas Brown Harvey has a list of 6 sexual health principles, which I'm sure have been covered a million times on the podcast, but 1,000,001 is not too many. So consent, non-exploitative, safety, honesty, sharing values, mutual pleasure. As we talk to young people, or as we think about our own plan for or vision for sexual health, how does consent play into that? How does non-exploitative play into that? How does safety or protection from unwanted pregnancy, HIV, STIs, things like that? How does that play into my vision for sexual health, or my child's vision for their sexual health? Can we be honest about desires, fears, fantasies, or do we hide those things? Can we share what our values are with our partner? Can we share those values with our kids? Can we listen to our kids as they share their values with us? Can we talk about, like, what if those values aren't the same? And yes, that might feel scary as a parent, but that's kind of the job as a parent, right? Is to teach your children how to not need you anymore. So I don't want my kids to be hanging on to my values. I want them to develop their own. And yep, that's scary sometimes because they might choose things that are different than me.
Right. There's that leap of faith and
Mm-hmm.
trusting your child's true self again.
Right. And then can we include a discussion on mutual pleasure? Because mutual pleasure opens, like, being able to talk about that's a thing in sexuality, opens the door, like maybe sex is not a bad thing, and that it's supposed to feel good, and like I get to choose, how this is going to look, and how I get to enjoy my own sexuality. So I think mutual pleasure, that discussion can open the door so much to addressing some of the issues, the shame issues.
I love that. Thank you so much, Alice. Is there any last thing you want to say or add or wrap up with before we end?
I just want to maybe end with this idea that, all of us have parts, and sometimes we don't like those parts very much. But I want to encourage sitting with those parts a little bit more, and drawing back to, when those parts get big, drawing back to, what would I do in this situation if I was feeling calm or curious or compassionate or courageous or creative or connected or confident, or I had some clarity? Would that change what I'm doing right now? Would that change my approach? Um, because we don't have to stay stuck with the scared parts or the shame parts driving the bus.
Absolutely. And that when they do drive the bus, take a deep breath.
Mhm.
Take a deep
'Cause
breath, give that part a hug.
they're just trying to keep us safe.
Yep. Yep. We're just trying to get our needs met, and sometimes the habits we've learned, especially around control, often the habits we've learned for trying to keep ourselves safe or to meet our needs aren't very effective. And so we have to learn it. We have to learn a new skill. We have to learn what is effective and how do I implement that. And the good news is that what is effective is trusting in your true self and trusting in your children's true self. And that, like I think that there's a real, sense of like grace, again, coming back to a religious word in that, right? In that idea of my true self actually wants to make the world a better place. My true self wants connection with my children and with my partner. My true self wants to love and be loved. That's kind of the core of these ideas of curiosity and compassion. And my true self is something I can trust.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for having me, Lisa.
Thank you so much for coming, Alice. This was great. We will put a link to that Vernacchio book. Is it Vernacchio?
I think it's Vernacchio.
Vernacchio.
I might be wrong.
Yeah, and I will put a link to the Family Acceptance Project. And if you guys have any questions, let us know. And thank you for listening to the Mormon Sex Info podcast.
We took the long road home, turned minutes into miles, and as the evening traveled on, the sunset bathed your smile. We stopped beneath the desert stars, wrapped in each other's arms. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth.
A trail with tears, pain and sorrow too.
But through every storm we traveled on, like lovers do. And if sometimes we fell apart, we always came back home. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth. Some people say love is blind and forever is too long. But I see your eyes in every sunrise. Can't imagine life alone. Let's take the long road on together until we're gone. Want you by my side till the day I die and into the beyond. It's as simple as our love is. That's how I wanna go, all wrapped up in the arms ordinary. It's nothing ordinary love. Ordinary.
Ordinary.
No, it's extraordinary.